Book to movie adaptations have been a hotly debated topic basically since we first started adapting books into films. There's a very significant amount of people out there who believe that books just can't be properly adapted into the medium of film, and often the main reason has to do with the level of detail present within a book. Because books are told through words, it allows for the level of information being communicated to the audience to be much greater. Books have the benefit that they are not actively moving, that the reader, in a way, decides when the story continues. The thing about movies is that they are, moving. It's kind of in the name. Most film adaptations of novels generally try to stick close to the source material that they are adapting. The director of the movie will do their best to keep the core story the same, making sure that all the important plot points are met and that the characters feel faithful to the original. It isn't uncommon to see changes made, often done for the sake of time, like cutting scenes that aren't central to the main story, or sometimes finding ways to visualize or condense information told to the reader. But often, there is an attempt made to try and keep as much of the film as close to the book it is adapting as possible. However, there have been book-to-movie adaptations that have changed a large amount about the core story, sometimes until the story barely even resembles its source material. A good example of this is How to Train Your Dragon, which was originally a book by Cressida Cowell released in 2003, with a movie releasing from DreamWorks in 2010. Now, while the very basics, such as the general setting and the names of the characters, remain mostly the same, major alterations were made, such as dragons no longer being able to talk like they could in the book, and in the book, Vikings and dragons were not at war with each other, and Toothless wasn't a Night Fury. In fact, it seems like it would take less time to list the things that didn't change than the things that did. You could honestly make the argument that the movie is more just inspired by the book than it is an adaptation of it. So what happens when one of the greatest directors of all time adapts a book written by one of the greatest authors of all time, each who interpret the story in a completely different way? Well, that's basically the case with The Shining. The Shining was originally a novel published by Stephen King in 1977. If you don't know the general plot of The Shining, first of all, what are you doing here? Secondly, I'll just do a brief recap. Essentially, the story is about a family called the Torrances, a father, Jack, who is an aspiring writer, his wife, Wendy, and their son, Danny. Jack is hired to be the winter caretaker at a hotel called the Overlook Hotel. We learn very early on that the hotel has a somewhat dark history, as the previous caretaker went crazy and murdered his entire family. Jack hears about this, but he's all like,
I missed the part where that's my problem.
Their son, Danny, however, isn't too keen on the hotel because he has psychic powers that tell him that it's haunted. Typical Stephen King stuff. Now, Stephen King was originally inspired to write The Shining after staying at the Stanley Hotel in Colorado. One thing I've noticed about a lot of King's best works is that they tend to come from his own fears or anxieties. For example, his book Pet Sematary was inspired by an event that nearly happened to King's son, and with The Shining, King drew from many of the things that he was experiencing in his life at the time. One major aspect of Jack's character in the story is his struggle with alcohol addiction. We learn that he used to be a heavy drinker until one day, during a drunken rage, he ended up dislocating Danny's arm. This marks a major turning point for Jack, as after this, he quits drinking for good and vows to be a better husband and father. Despite becoming sober, Jack never really loses the craving for a drink, and he is constantly battling with it throughout the novel. King drew from his own battle with alcoholism and the struggles it caused for him and his family. Jack Torrance is probably the closest King has ever come to writing a straight-up self-insert character, all the way down to the detail of him also being a struggling writer. This is all to say that The Shining is a book that is very personal to King. So what would he say when given the chance to have his book adapted by Stanley Kubrick, one of the greatest film directors to have ever lived? Well, let's be honest. Was saying no ever really an option? I mean, it probably was, but regardless, King agreed to the film even with the knowledge that Kubrick had plans on drastically changing the story. The thing you need to understand about Stanley Kubrick is that he was a very meticulous filmmaker, often to the point where it bordered on obsession. He had a very clear vision for his films, and he would stop at nothing until the film was exactly as he envisioned it. This made Kubrick a director that a lot of actors just outright refused to work with, as there are reports of him doing well over 100 takes of a single scene. In other words, Kubrick was kinda strange to say the least, and I don't mean that in a negative way. For example, despite having his pilot's license, Kubrick was deathly afraid of flying, and so every time he had to travel overseas, he would go by boat. Still not convinced? Okay, Kubrick was also an excessive hoarder and had an entire archive of old receipts, bills, magazines, etc. So yeah, he was a bit weird. But there's also no denying that Kubrick was a master of his craft. Even those who hated him couldn't deny his sheer brilliance. Honestly, Stanley Kubrick deserves his own dedicated video, so I'll move on for now. I say all of this to emphasize that Kubrick never planned on adapting The Shining faithfully. He always had plans to make the story his own, even if it meant completely changing the original message of Stephen King's novel. And when it came to the relationship between Kubrick and King, well, it was a rocky one from the start. While King seemed to like Kubrick enough, Kubrick was rather critical of King's work, calling his writing sloppy, but he did admit that the actual plot of the book was pretty good and enough to be made into a movie. Kubrick's actual reason for creating The Shining was mostly due to needing to recuperate losses from his previous film. Prior to making The Shining, Kubrick had directed the 1975 film Barry Lyndon. While that movie was generally liked by critics, it failed financially at the box office, so when deciding what his next film would be, Kubrick decided to pick something that would be an almost guaranteed success. And with how popular Stephen King had become by that time, picking one of his novels was a surefire way to turn a profit. Additionally, he saw this film as his entry into the horror genre. Kubrick preferred for all of his pictures to act as his forte in different types of film genres. 2001 was sci-fi, Doctor Strangelove was comedy, Full Metal Jacket was war, you get the idea. It was inevitable that he'd have to try horror at some point, and so he saw this as an opportunity to kill two birds with one stone. But when I say that Stanley Kubrick had plans to make this film his own, well, what exactly do I mean by that? Just what does it mean to be a Kubrick film? Well, if I were to describe Kubrick's stories in one word, it would be cynical. A lot of his movies tend to focus on the worst aspects of humanity. Eyes Wide Shut depicts societal corruption, Full Metal Jacket depicts the horrors of war, and if you've seen A Clockwork Orange, I probably don't need to explain that one. And The Shining? Well, The Shining shows a father's slow descent into madness. Though Stephen King's books can get incredibly dark at times, most of them tend to have an ultimately hopeful tone, that good will always triumph over evil, that our characters can win in the end. Kubrick movies don't tend to share this same philosophy. In regards to the narrative of The Shining, well, the two are very different from the start. Jack Torrance in the film is somewhat aloof from the very beginning. He often comes off as frustrated, annoyed, or sometimes even downright hostile, especially when interacting with his wife, Wendy. You can see this very clearly when they're in the car. When Wendy tries to strike up a conversation, all Jack does in response is nod his head. And when Danny says that he's hungry, Jack replies,
"Well, you should have eaten your breakfast."
This is a departure from the book, where Jack is much warmer and caring towards his family. We learn early on in one of the chapters that Jack has had a long history of trouble controlling his anger. I mentioned previously that Jack had drunkenly injured Danny, which caused him to give up drinking, but prior to that, Jack had even been fired from his job as a school teacher after he assaulted a student who slashed his tires. It's later explained that the root of Jack's anger comes from the abuse he suffered as a child at the hands of his own father. Jack's guilt over the incident with Danny weighs very heavily on him throughout the story, as he fears becoming like his father. But a majority of what I just mentioned is completely absent from the film. We learn that Jack quit drinking after hurting Danny, and that's about it. We learn nothing about his past, his family, and Jack doesn't seem to hold any real guilt over the incident. In fact, the only time we see him talk about what happened, he comes off as quite the opposite, seeming rather dismissive of his actions. By the way, if you aren't aware, the scenes I'm using to represent the book are from the 1997 TV miniseries, which, in my opinion, isn't all that bad. I mean, yeah, the effects look utterly atrocious.
You don't want to be like this. This is disgusting.
But story-wise, it is a much more faithful adaptation of the book. Obviously, it's nowhere near as good as the movie, but I still think it's fun to watch. Jack's relationship with his wife Wendy has been completely altered as well. In the book, Jack is far more affectionate with Wendy. In fact, Wendy's character as a whole is explored much more in depth in the book, but that honestly goes for the entire rest of the cast as well. A lot of this just comes down to the fundamental differences between movies and novels. A book is able to provide a lot more insight and context than a movie is. However, Wendy in the book is an almost completely different character, even more so than Jack is. The film's version of Wendy is rather meek, fragile. She spends a large chunk of the movie crying and only stands up to Jack once he starts threatening her and Danny. She's practically the complete opposite in the novel, where she doesn't take any of Jack's shit and even threatened to divorce him if he didn't quit drinking. Shortly after the film was released, Stephen King criticized Kubrick's portrayal of her character as being misogynistic. As for Danny, well, actually not too much has changed about him in the movie. In fact, out of the three Torrances, Danny is the closest to his book counterpart. However, one major change is with the character of Tony. Tony is Danny's imaginary friend, supposedly. In both the movie and the novel, Tony acts as the manifestation of Danny's shining powers, and in both stories, Tony is the one that warns Danny about the hotel, showing him visions of what is to come. However, unlike the book, the movie doesn't ever have Tony actually appear to Danny. The only time we hear Tony is when he's speaking through Danny, and this kind of leads me to a larger difference between the film and the novel, and is that the film contains far fewer overtly supernatural elements. While the novel makes it undeniable that the ghosts at the overlooked hotel are responsible for what is happening, the movie leaves it far more vague, allowing the viewer to make their own interpretations of the events unfolding. A popular theory for the film is that there actually is nothing supernatural going on, and that all of what is happening is taking place inside Jack's head, or more specifically, inside the book that he's writing. But you see, this is sort of what I meant when I said that Kubrick was going to make the film his own. Anyone who's familiar with his catalog knows that Kubrick isn't exactly known for always being clear about what his films are truly about. You need only look at 2001: A Space Odyssey for an example. What is that movie about? Well, depending on who you ask, it's either about aliens, the dangers of technology, the fragility of the human mind, the cycle of evolution, ascension to godhood, or just all of the above. And while I mentioned the no ghost theory about The Shining, other popular theories about the movie include it being a secret confession from Kubrick that he helped fake the moon landing, an allegory for the genocide of the Native Americans, CIA experiments, or that the story takes place in hell. Going back to the actual comparison between these two stories, while the general events play out the same, Danny begins seeing things, the hotel convinces Jack to drink, Wendy grows increasingly worried about the family, and Dick Halloran makes his way back to the hotel following a vision he has, the nuances of how these events occur are completely changed. Now, since we're getting close to the end, here's a quick rapid fire of scenes that either don't happen or are changed from the book. The Grady twins, Here's Johnny, All Work and No Play, and a Man in the Bear costume are all movie-only additions. The hedge maze is entirely absent from the novel, and in its place is a topiary of hedge animals that come to life when no one is looking. Dick Halloran dies in the movie while he lives in the book, and lastly, Room 237 is Room 217 in the novel. The scene in which Jack is convinced to drink again is drastically different from the novel as well. In the novel, Jack is very hesitant to drink again and is much more suspicious of what he is seeing. It requires Lloyd as well as the other guests at the bar pressuring Jack for him to finally drink. The conversation that occurs right after in the movie doesn't really occur at all in the book, but it is a scene that gives us a lot of insight into who Jack is in this film. This is the only time that we actually see Jack address what he did to Danny, and he shows absolutely no remorse, consistently deflecting blame onto both Wendy and Danny. But honestly, given what we've seen from Jack up until this point, what he says really isn't all that surprising. When Jack begins slipping in the book, it's treated as tragic. The audience is meant to be rooting for him to win his internal fight. But in the movie, it feels like we're just watching an already depraved man fall further into depravity. And that's really the key difference between the two versions of the character. Book Jack is a flawed but ultimately well-meaning person driven to madness by outside forces, while movie Jack feels like we're watching an insane person up until the point that they finally snap. And I think this is best illustrated in the different ways that the two stories end. In both versions, Jack ends up being finally overtaken by the hotel and begins trying to kill Wendy and Danny. In the movie he uses an axe, while in the book he uses a rope mallet. While I already mentioned that Dick Halloran dies in the film, there's one other major change that was made from the novel, and it is the final interaction between Jack and Danny. In the movie, the last time Jack ever sees Danny is as he is chasing him through the hedge maze. And aside from not having the hedge maze at all, the book has one other key moment, one that completely changes the tone of the ending. The scene takes place as Jack is chasing Danny through the hotel. Danny ends up cornered, and in a tense moment, Jack is able to briefly break free from the hotel's control. And it is here that their last interaction is Jack telling Danny to run, and to remember how much he loves him. Then the hotel explodes. Yeah. But not before Wendy, Dick, and Danny are able to get away. It is a tragic but bittersweet conclusion. If the Joker is to be believed, people show who they truly are in their last moments, and Jack's last moments were him protecting his son. It's a fitting end to the story of a man who always struggled with being the father he wanted to be. I know Stephen King is often criticized for his endings, and while I don't think that criticism is entirely unfounded, I do think the ending to The Shining is very fitting. And the film? Well, it ends like a Kubrick film, which is to say, somewhat suddenly and with little explanation. Jack freezes to death in the maze, Wendy and Danny get away, leaving the hotel to freeze. And we end on a rather ominous zoom in on a photo. A crowd stands gathered, and at the front is Jack. The photo is dated July 4th, 1921. Now I could make a whole video just about theories on the ending, but I think the most popular one is that the Overlook ended up absorbing Jack, and that he will now exist among the souls of the hotel, trapped in an endless July 4th ball, awaiting their next victim. Now Stanley Kubrick himself has more or less confirmed that the ending is trying to suggest reincarnation of some sort, but I honestly feel like that just barely scratches the surface of it. One theory I've always liked is the idea that the Overlook Hotel itself is a living entity. One detail that many people have noticed is that the layout of the Overlook Hotel is quite literally impossible. Danny is able to ride his tricycle on one floor, go down a hallway, and end up on another. Windows appear where they shouldn't, and rooms are much larger than they reasonably should be. Kubrick intentionally made the design of the hotel disjointed to increase the feeling of unease. You can see them discussing the layout in the BBC documentary about the film, which if you haven't already, I'd highly recommend checking out that documentary as it gives a very good look into the behind the scenes of The Shining. It was also filmed by Stanley Kubrick's daughter, Vivian Kubrick, who is frequently present on the set and even had a cameo in the film, right here. She's made appearances in a few of his other movies and even helped compose the score for Full Metal Jacket. She's still alive, by the way. I wonder how she's doing. Okay. The thing about The Shining is that it really is the kind of movie that can be interpreted in so many ways that part of the fun is just figuring out how outlandish your theories can get. While they may be very different from each other, each version of The Shining is great in its own right. The book tells the story of a struggling father wanting to do good but being pulled away by dark forces, while the movie is about a hatred-fueled man who is finally given an outlet for his rage. I feel like trying to compare them is honestly kind of pointless because they're not trying to be the same thing. They are different stories with different intentions, and both stories accomplish what they set out to do. This definitely isn't the last time I'll talk about a Kubrick movie on this channel. It may not even be the last time I talk about The Shining, but I'll leave it here for now. And like many others, I am also eagerly awaiting the release of the Kubrick collection. Just kidding, I don't have that kind of money. But yeah, that's all I have to say for now. See y'all whenever I upload next.